In grand dining table of the mansion, the man near his 30s sat. His knife against the porcelain plate was the only sound in the room as he flipped through several news channels, looking for something that caught his interest. Authorities have confirmed that her body was discovered in an abandoned warehouse a week ago. Her death the result of severe blunt force trauma. Investigators are still piecing together the events leading up to the attack, but sources reveal that Park Ni-ha had been working on a sensitive case before her untimely death. Park Ni-ha was last seen 9 days ago, following a public argument with none other than Daniel Kim, the respected Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs. Witnesses claim the two exchanged heated words over Ni-ha's recent articles, which had allegedly uncovered corruption within government circles. While no formal charges have been made, reports suggest that Park Ni-ha received threatening messages after the argument, messages allegedly linked to the deputy minister himself. Kim Daniel name echoed, but his expression remained unchanged, almost bored, as he took another bite of his toast. His secretary, Mr. Choi, stood by his side, stiff and silent, like a well-trained dog. Daniel placed his fork on the tar, as he calmly reached for his napkin, wiping the corners of his mouth with precision. The police are currently investigating the case, and while no suspects have been formally identified, pressure is mounting for answers in Park Ni-ha's tragic death. Investigators are now looking into her recent interactions, particularly her conflict with Deputy Minister Kim, to determine if her death was politically motivated. He pushed his empty plate aside as the anchor stopped speaking. He folded his napkin neatly, placing it beside his plate, before looking up at his secretary with a cold smile. "Daniel, it seems I'm the topic of conversation again, Choi." A faint smile played on his lips as he leaned back in his chair. "What a circus, don't you think? Daniel, it never ceases to amaze me how predictable the media can be. Let the police investigate. They won't find anything incriminating." Mr. Choi nodded obediently. "Shall I handle any inquiries from the press, sir?" "Yes, do that. And make sure to remind them of my spotless record." Daniel's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We wouldn't want the public to get the wrong impression, would we?" With that, he stood, unbothered by the storm gathering around his name. To him, it was just another day. Sitting in front of the vanity, the 26-year-old gently massaging the cream into her soft skin. The light from the lamp beside her cast a warm glow on her reflection. She exhausted, but still beautiful. Her hand moved slowly over her face, applying the cream in steady circles as she stared at her reflection blankly. The door to the bedroom creaked open behind her. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The familiar sound of footsteps, she continued applying her cream, ignoring him as he moved around, his footsteps heavy, making the floorboards creak. The sound of him sitting on the edge of the bed and removing his shoes barely registered to her anymore. It had become just another part of the nightly routine she hated. "You're quiet tonight." His voice broke the silence she loved, his tone casual though there was an edge to it. He always had that edge, like he was ready to pounce on the smallest slip-up. Her fingers froze for a moment before she continued with her skincare routine. "Stay calm, stay composed," she told herself. "I have nothing to say." A chuckle, low and condescending, escaped his lips as he leaned back on the bed, propping himself up on his elbows. "You always have something to say, Yan. Your silence is suspicious." She met her own gaze in the mirror, fighting the urge to snap back. "I'm tired," she said, not showing how she was irritated from his mere presence. "I'd like to rest." His gaze slid over her from behind, predatory, as he watched her apply the cream to her arms and neck. Funny, he mused, you look perfectly fine to me. What are you tired from? Sitting around all day. Her grip tightened on the small jar in her hand. Pregnancy is exhausting, she said through gritted teeth, but of course, you wouldn't understand. Is that attitude I hear, sweetheart? His tone sharpened a little, his smile gone as he stood from the bed, moving toward her slowly. Don't forget who you're talking to. Her heartbeat quickened, but she didn't move. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Not tonight. I haven't forgotten, she said, lifting her chin slightly, eyes still fixed on the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her. You remind me every day. He was behind her now. He placed his hands on the arms of her chair, trapping her in place. His face was just inches away from hers, close enough that she could feel his breath on her neck, the heat from his body suffocating her. Good, he whispered, leaning down so his lips brushed against her ear. Because I'd hate to have to remind you in other ways. Her stomach churned at his words, nausea rising within her, not just from the pregnancy, but from the pure disgust she felt. Her fist clenched tightly in her lap, nails digging into her palm. But she couldn't move. She couldn't push him away. Daniel, are you forgetting who you belong to? She didn't answer, her chest rising up and down as she tried to keep her breathing in check. Daniel, I ask you something. His thumb traced her lower lips, then traced down to her neck. He caressed the purplish bruise with his thumb. And she swat his hand away. Don't touch me. She gritted out, and he only smiled. You think you can give me orders now? His fingers moved from the chair to her hair, brushing it back, but she jerked her head away from his touch. He laughed softly at her attempt to resist. You're mine, YN. And everything you do, every breath you take, is because I allow it. Don't forget that. She closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears threatening to spill. She hated him. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, to fight, to push him away, but her body wouldn't obey. His hand moved to her cheek, his fingers cold against her warm skin. He cupped her face. Lee K-hei owned it, leaning down to kiss her, his breath brushing against her lips. That was the final straw. She pushed him away with all her force, her hands trembling as she shoved him back. He stumbled back for a moment, surprised by the sudden strength in her. His face darkened quickly, his smile gone, though, his eyes narrowing as he straightened up. Bold tonight, aren't we? He took a step toward her, his towering figure making her look small, vulnerable. Is that what pregnancy does to you? Makes you forget your place? Her breath hitched, but she didn't back down. I'm not scared of you, she lied, trying her best to keep her voice steady. Not anymore. A smirk curled at the edges of his lips as he loomed over her, his hand reaching out to grip her chin, forcing her to look up at him. His fingers were rough, digging into her skin. Oh, sweetheart, he mocked, you should be. He let go of her chin, his hand dropping to her belly, and she stiffened, her heart pounding as he placed his palm over the baby. His baby. You see this, his voice was calm, but there was an underlying threat. This keeps you here, you don't have anywhere else to go, YN. No one to run to. You belong to me. She swallowed, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. I don't belong to you, she whispered in a shaky voice, nor I'll ever love you. His eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, she thought he might strike her, but instead, he pulled away, turning his back on her with a scoff. Love? He laughed, the sound cold and cruel just like he was, as he moved back toward Thebes. Who needs love, sweetheart? I have control. He sat down, kicking off the rest of his shoes as if their conversation hadn't happened, as if her life wasn't being suffocated by his control. She turned back to the mirror, her reflection now blurred by the tears she'd fought so hard to hold back. She sat down, hands trembling as she reached for the jar of cream again. But this time, her heart felt heavier. There had to be a way out. Just handle it. I don't have time for this nonsense. Daniel hung up the phone with a sharp click, muttering the last few words. He sighed, running a hand through his hair just as a knock came at the door. Come in, he called out, Turning slightly in his chair, Choi entered the room and bowed respectfully. Daniel, now what bad news you have come with? Sir, the media is going crazy. They are all demanding answers about the murder case. It's getting out of hand. They want your presence for clarification. Daniel sighed, his eyes shifting briefly to the bathroom door. The shower was still running, meaning his lovely and wife was still inside. He turned his attention back to his secretary, clearly annoyed by the situation. This again? Choi, yes, sir. The police are also asking to speak with you. They are insisting on a formal interview. He scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Just tip them off, they are hungry bitches anyway. Throw a few cents their way, and they'll shut their mouths. Choi hesitated. I've tried, sir, but there's a new chief on the case. He's not backing down like the others. He rolled his eyes and scoffed, his annoyance deepening. New chief, huh? Let's see how long her lasts. Choi, also, tonight there's a party, sir. The new chief is expected to attend, smirked, his gaze turning cold. Oh, perfect. Let's meet this stubborn bastard tonight. Choi, I've arranged a car for you, sir. Should I inform Miss Talia to accompany you? Daniel, no. Not tonight. My wife will be accompanying me. Choi looked at him with surprise, if only for a millisecond, before he masked his reaction. Why, sir? Kim Daniel had never taken his wife anywhere in public during their 3 years of marriage. She was merely a figure kept behind closed doors. Is there a problem with that, Choi? No, sir. Not at all. Choi quickly bowed again, understanding the warning. I'll make the arrangements. Without another word, he left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Just as the door clicked shut, Wyan stepped out of the bathroom, steam following her into the room. She ignored her husband completely, not even glancing his way as she went to her dresser to get dressed. Daniel, Choi is waiting for you. She turned to look at him. You are talking to me. Oh, the walls behind you. Do you see anyone other you and me? She looked away, but her brows furrowed. So. Mr. Choi waiting for me. But for what? His gaze followed her every movement. You need to buy some clothes for tonight. Wyan, clothes? For what? He leaned against the dresser, his eyes narrowing slightly. For a party. We are going together. Me? Why do I need to go with you? She was confused. He never took her put. She never went out with him in public places. I hate when you ask useless questions, Wyan. How about you just do as I say, without making it difficult? She averted her gaze and it settled on her lap. I already have clothes. I can wear something from my closet. Clothes you have? He scoffed, standing up straight. None of those are suitable for an event like this. They are outdated, plain, and far from classy. Wyan clenched her fists. He never missed a chance to degrade her, to remind her of how unworthy she was in his eyes. Daniel sighed, he tilted his head, watching her reaction. You'll go shopping, wear what I tell you, and be by my side tonight. Understood. Understood, she whispered, without any more argument. Sitting stiffly in the back seat of the sleek black car, Wyan hands gripping the fur wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She hated the clothes Daniel had forced her to wear. The dress was tight and revealing, doing little to cover herself properly. The fur wrap was more for decoration than warmth, barely concealing the baby bump she was so desperate to hide. Discomfort was too much, not just from the clothes, but from the entire situation. This was the first time Daniel had taken her out in public. In the 3 years of their marriage, he'd never shown her off, never wanted her beside him. He always said she wasn't good enough, not his caliber, not as pretty as the women he usually surrounded himself with. She knew all too well who those women were, especially Talia, his secretary, who was beautiful and always seemed to be at his side. She had seen the way Daniel looked at her. The way he dismissed her entirely, making her feel invisible, like she wasn't worth even being his arm candy. Yet tonight, here she was. Her husband sat beside her, scrolling through his phone, indifferent to her obvious discomfort. Then, without warning, his hand rested on her bare thigh, his fingers cold against her skin. She tensed against his touch, wishing she could move away, but as he ran his hand slowly up and down her exposed thigh, his touch sickening, possessive. Daniel, you look good tonight. Finally dressed properly for once. His voice was soft, too soft, dripping with that sweet yet sickening tone she had come to hate. She didn't respond, keeping her gaze fixed on the passing city lights outside the window. His fingers tightened slightly on her thigh, a subtle reminder of his control. Don't embarrass Meta Knight, YN. Just smile, stay quiet, you're going to act like you're in love with me. In love with him? The very idea made her want to scream, but she knew better than to show her disgust. Don't even think about talking to anyone, he continued, his fingers now tracing circles on her thigh. Because if you do, well, let's just say you won't like the consequences. Daniel, you know how I can be when you disobey me. She bit down on her lip. She hated how he talked to her, how he controlled her like a puppet. She was nothing more than a possession. You'll do exactly what I say, won't you? He whispered, his lips close to her ear now. He smiled at her compliance, his hand giving her thigh one last squeeze before he leaned back, satisfied. Good girl. She swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. The whole night was already a nightmare, and it hadn't even begun. The room was filled with powerful men and women, politicians, business moguls, and socialites, people she had only ever seen on TV. Now, she was standing among them, feeling completely out of place. Course, thrived in this environment. He stood tall, commanding the attention of everyone around him. As they stopped to greet a pair of politicians, she silently observed the interaction, her eyes flicking to the floor every now and then, trying to avoid the gazes cast her way. Two men approached them, and the conversation quickly turned to politics, something she had no interest in but was forced to endure. She stood there, quiet, as they spoke about upcoming bills and power plays. One of the men, glancing between them, suddenly asked, "Who's she, by the way?" His brow furrowed slightly in confusion. "I didn't see you come with the woman you usually do." He barely glanced at her. "That was my secretary. This is my wife, Kim YN." The two men exchanged looks, one of them raising an eyebrow in surprise before letting hisses roam up and down her form. "Whoa, so we finally have a chance to meet your wife." He chuckled, sharing a look with the other man. "I see why you never came with her before." Daniel's smile was thin, as if the comment pleased him. "If I had a wife like her, this pretty, I'd never show her to the world either." Pretty? They couldn't mean it. Not in the way Daniel saw her. To him, she was anything but that. He didn't hide her because she was beautiful. He hid her because she wasn't good enough. She had believed it for so long, and seeing the smile on his face, as he accepted their compliments, only confirmed what she already knew. Couldn't bring herself to look up, not yet. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face him. Not after all these years. When Daniel introduced her, she barely heard him. It wasn't until she forced herself to look up, to meet the face that went with the name, that her breath truly caught. Their eyes met, and for a second, her world stopped spinning. There was a hint of surprise in his eyes, just as there was in hers. But he quickly masked it, his expression neutral, as he gave her a polite nod. "Chief John, my wife, YN," Daniel said, his arm slipping possessively around her waist. Jungkook's gaze flickered between them. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Kim." Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she barely managed a nod in return, too shocked to see anything. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. "Daniel, we need to talk," Jungkook said, turning his attention back to her husband. His tone was professional now, but there was an edge to it. "You know why I'm here." Daniel's smirk didn't falter. He looked down at YN for a moment, his hand moving to caress her cheek gently before placing a kiss on her forehead. "Daniel, baby, why don't you go sit down? Drink something. Standing for too long will tire you out, and we don't want that, do we?" Her barely reacted, her body on autopilot. She caught a glimpse of Jungkook watching them. Without a word, she turned and walked away, not daring to look back. She never imagined out of all people, she would meet her ex in this situation. Jungkook washed his hands, the cool water running over his fingers, as he scrubbed them clean, lost in thought. He reached for a tissue, wiping his hands dry before tossing it into the bin. The conversation with Daniel Kim replayed in his mind, as he opened the bathroom door, and stepped out. Daniel didn't seem like someone capable of murder, at least not in the way people typically imagine. But Jungkook had learned long ago that the most dangerous people were often Theans who seemed the most harmless. Every smile he flashed during their conversation felt wrong, too practiced, too polished. His words were coated in sugar, but Jungkook could sense the venom underneath. Something about him didn't sit right, and as a chief of police, Jungkook's instincts were rarely wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling there was something Deputy Minister was hiding. He learned to trust his gut, and right now, it was telling him to dig deeper. He wasn't here just to close a case. He was here to get to the truth, no matter how well hidden it was. He was going towards the stairs, walked down the hallway, but a movement caught his attention. He glanced up and froze. There was a familiar figure standing on first stair. She looked just as he remembered, but different too. Her lips were pouted, and her eyes were focused on the stairs in front of her, as if she were debating whether or not to walk down. He knew that look. She hated stairs. She always said they drained her energy, a complaint she had made more than once when they were younger.